And here we are with Dirk Lohan, my friend, mentor, colleague, and partner for going on 40 years now and still counting. Welcome to the show, Dirk.
Yes, thank you very much, Floyd. It's been a pleasure to know you and work with you. And here we are again.
Yep. So, Dirk, Steve, Brittany, and I have just finished our show intro where I gave a small overview of who you are and explained what today's show is about, which is your journey on becoming an architect. We'd like to talk about what some of the early days of your life were like, perhaps some observations on the design profession back when you started versus today, and things like that. So that's kind of the subject today. So, Steve, could you start us off?
Sure. So, Dirk, from what I understand, your grandfather or great grandfather was a mason. Your grandfather was an architect of, well, renowned architect. Was it always assumed you were going to be an architect?
No, I wouldn't think so at all, but at least not in my mind. But my story is a long story now. It started in 1938, which is exactly the year that my grandfather Mies left Germany and came to Chicago. So he saw me when I was a really just born little baby. I do not remember that,
Makes
but
sense.
but I was the firstborn male succession. He had three daughters himself. My mother is one of his daughters, and the beginning of my life was dominated certainly not about architectural thoughts as a child, but the normal life as a kid, going to school. We lived in the country outside Berlin, and of course, the war interfered here and there, and I saw attacking bombers flying overhead and occasionally dropping a bomb nearby, and then eventually in 1945 we through the wisdom of my father, who was actually a history professor. He had studied in England, so he was a little bit more familiar with what was going to happen after the war. He took the family and moved us to an area that would be occupied by the American troops, which it was, out the south of Berlin, much more towards Bavaria, and after President Roosevelt died, the Potsdam Conference, Truman was the new president, and he gave away that area where we lived to the Soviets. And so overnight, we were exactly one night. I remember this as a kid. I was maybe 7, 8 years old. The tanks rolled, trucks rolled through the streets, and a lot of noise in the night, but quiet. There was no shooting or anything. In the morning, the Russians were there, and the Americans had all left. So we soon thereafter packed up again and quietly left to go to the West.
Hey, Dirk, I'm curious, how would you describe the style of the house you grew up in?
Well, the house was actually, it had a maybe not quite warranted name. It was called a castle. It was a big house. You would call it a big mansion. But it wasn't our house. We lived on the second main floor as tenants. And down below was the manager of the house. I cannot even tell you who owned really the house, but it was an old farm estate with lots of land and farming, and there were plants and animals and all of that sort of stuff, which was a good environment for a kid. I mean, and the house was also overlooking a lake, not a huge lake like Lake Michigan, but a very nice lake, maybe similar to Lake Geneva type situation. and there was boating and playing on the beach, etc. It was a nice environment while it lasted.
Okay.
Can you dive deeper into your education, both here in the U.S. and back in Germany?
Yeah, well, maybe I should to go back. And as a kid, I went through the normal German system, which is first you go to grade school, and then at age 10, you enter what's called gymnasium, which is, you would say, high school. But the German gymnasium was a 9-year program. So when I graduated, I was 19, and I had, because we actually eventually moved to an area that was occupied by the French troops after the war. This was common in those days. The first foreign language you learned was the language of the occupying troops in Germany. So if you were in the British, you learned British. In the Russian, you learned Russian. In the French, we learned French. So I learned French from age 10 on. And for 9 years, I had French. And I was... I liked very much. In my family, I was known as the Francophile. My father was the Anglophile because he had studied in England before the war. So the fact that I now speak English and my French has faded away is really related to the many years I've lived in America.
So was English your third language then?
Yes.
Wow.
Well, I also had Latin and ancient Greek.
And how's that today?
Somehow nobody uses it anymore.
Nice.
But the Latin was very helpful because when you think of any language, but English is half Germanic and half Latino, Latin roots. There's a lot of words that you immediately know what they mean because of these other languages.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dirk, one of the things that always fascinated me, and I know not a lot of people that actually know you realize this, is that you write with your right hand, but you actually draw most of the time with your left hand.
Correct.
Why is that?
Well, I'm really a lefty. I'm proud of it. I was born that way. But in the strict Nazi time in school, somehow, I don't know if this was a national thing or whether just my teacher wouldn't allow me to write with my right hand. I had to learn to write with my right hand. With my left hand, he wouldn't allow, So, I'm always amazed when I see people like, I think Obama was a lefty. On TV, sometimes I see when they sign something and they take the pen in their left hand and, how awkward that is. So I do write with my right hand. I draw with my left hand. I eat with my left hand. I throw with my left hand. I'm an oddity, and that describes my personality pretty well.
It's too bad you're not a baseball pitcher.
Yes.
I think one of the things that always interested me is there's a geometry to writing. So when you're writing with your right hand, your hand stays out of the way of the ink.
That's correct.
Now, not so much. It's not a concern. But back when you were
Yes,
learning to write,
yes.
you had to, people tend to rotate their left hand
Yes,
around their pen.
you have to get out of the way. Yeah.
So you don't drag your hand through the wet
Correct,
ink.
correct.
So I wonder if that's part of...
That may have been the reason.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So going back to
But the school, the grade school I went to, this is really in the 40s, was a country school, like a schoolhouse in the country, and you see it here in the Midwest. And all the grades, the different ages, were all in one room. The teacher was teaching everybody, so you could hear what the older kids are learning, and that was always interesting. I found it stimulating.
Well, that's
To be-
the American prairie is very similar.
Yes, right.
So once you graduated high school, when did you move immediately to Chicago? Or
No. No, I never left my native country, Germany, until I was 19. I'm 19. After graduating from high school, I came to Chicago went to IIT, but all the prior years, we moved several times. You have to imagine these were the post-World War II years. Housing was not easy. My family was split up. I lived with my grandmother in the country for 2 years, and my sisters lived with the other grandmother in another town, and my father had a job in the third place, because housing wasn't available for a family of five, and 3 kids and 2 adults. So that all came with time, and when times got better, we all got together again. But then I was also sent, which has been a little bit of tradition in my family prior to that. Mises' 2 other daughters, they went in the 20s and 30s to boarding schools, prep schools. So I went to a couple of those schools where you lived in dormitories with other kids. Yeah.
And was that in Germany?
Yes.
So let's move on to some of the questions about your architectural experience. Like Brittany, you started to ask about when he moved
To
to
Chicago.
to Chicago, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your decision to finally move over here and that whole period of your life.
Well, I should say now I didn't in all these years since childhood, I was very much aware that my father's father, my mother's father, was a well-known architect. She admired him, and she would always talk about this or that.
And what was that guy's name again?
Mies van der Rohe. And
I think I've heard of him.
and in the family, we called him Pa. So he was Pa. And I was where I was born, when my mother married my father. Mies gave them some furniture to equip their first apartment. And I was born into it, and I grew up in it. And there was the Mies daybed, and there were the MR chairs, and all of this from day one. So I have not made an adjustment in my stylistic tastes from early childhood to now. It's all the same, I've always appreciated these modern pieces. And then when I was 14 years old, Mies, for the first time after World War II, came back to visit Germany in 1952. This was a very fertile period for him. The Crown Hall had just been done. The Farnsworth House was done. 860. All these famous buildings had just been completed, and Germany was reaching out also to invite him, and they were trying to do a theater in one town, and that Berlin wanted him to participate at the Interbau, which is was an international building exhibition, sort of the first one of new things, how people should live in the future, and so on. And I was invited to participate with a bunch of local architects. I was 14 years old. They met Mies. They wanted to meet Mies, and there was a luncheon arranged, and I was allowed to sit at the end of the table. Mies was at the other end of the table, and they talked about architecture, what's going on, what they're all doing, and so on. And that was my first exposure, really, to Mies as an architect and how he talked and what he talked about. And I can tell you that the discussion with those other German architects was lively, funny. They laughed. And I knew Mies from day one always as a pretty articulate, outspoken, jovial guy, because this was his native tongue, and he could be like this. In English, he was always more reserved.
That's I think what everybody thinks of him as a reserved man.
Yes, he's known to be taciturn and doesn't say much. and has coined these aphorisms like "less is more," or whatever you want to mention. You can't invent a new architecture every Monday morning. That's. But that was because of language. I just experienced that many times, and so at that time, maybe at 14, I thought, well, architects are nice people. It's interesting what they talk about and building things. Every boy normally is interested in building things, so I had that interest. In addition to that, we had all the 8x10 Hedrick Blessing pictures sent from Mises' office. So there was the Farnsworth House, the 860, the Crown Hall. These were all pictures that had come to us, and my mother gave them to me, and I plastered my bedroom with them. So I grew up with all this stuff the day they were created.
So he was your sports star.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so then that's about, so 14 you said was about when you started to be interested. Then you came over
Well, then at
for
19,
education.
I agreed. I guess my mother had quite a bit to do with it, and she must have, wasn't aware of this, but she must have asked Mies in Chicago, would you be able to sponsor a year for Dirk at the school, private architecture school? And he said yes. So I came to Chicago, and Mies paid for all this, and I lived at IIT and went to school. But I was a little older than the other recent grads from high school. I was 19 and a half, and they were probably, 17 and 18. Yeah. That is not much, but I was also befriending a lot of the graduate students, and there were some foreigners, some other Germans, and British, Peter Carter, and people like that I hung out with as well.
At that time, how many students were at IIT for architecture?
I can't tell you exactly, but I would say that each year must have had 30. So what is that? 4, 5,
Over 100.
150, maybe a little less than 200. Today they have triple that.
Well, and I think when me started at IIT, they had, 10.
Yeah.
5 to 10.
Yes.
It's very small. So at that point, it had grown in stature
Yes.
and attendance.
Yes. That's correct.
And before you went to IIT, did you attend school in Munich, like technical school?
Architecture, no. I started architecture in Chicago, and I remember this was the time before the computers. We had to learn drafting. One of the lectures I got was how to take a little piece of sandpaper and sharpen your pencil. And when you draw a line that you have to turn it to keep it sharp. These are the things that we went through at IIT. Can you believe it?
Yep.
And then there were lots of drafting exercises, which eventually became visual training. But you know that, having been there yourself,
Yep.
that how it was good. I must say it's not bad to have done that. It's like learning a craft.
It really is a great discipline
Yes.
to have gone to that school and learn their craft and
Yes.
how they
Yes.
do it. And I think it resonates in your work as well.
Yeah.
I always felt like the real education was done outside the classroom. Can you speak of, social events that you went to, or lectures, or maybe even dinners that you had that, with your professors or with Mies in particular?
Yes. There were in that year that I was at IIT, as I said, I sort of befriended some of the graduate students, and I roomed with a guy from Munich, Konrad Roland was his name, who later wrote a book about Frei Otto, the suspension guy. And he was talented and worked also later in Mises' office. And through him, there were other people of his age. So we were a group of people, and we walked around Chicago. And one of the big hobbies we all had was photography. We had little photo competitions. We would meet every so often and show each other the the latest photographs. And one guy, another German, he always photographed black women, and that was his hobby. But some of us photographed architecture.
To each their own.
Yes.
So after your year at IIT, though, you returned to Germany, correct?
Yes, I returned to Germany, and the reason was that I was madly in love with a high school sweetheart, my first wife, Heidi, who was still there, and I came back, and we did get married eventually, and two of my children were born there while I was a student in Munich, and I graduated in Munich. And upon graduation, all of us moved to America.
So can you talk about maybe the differences between that two forms of education, 1 year at IIT and then the technical school in Munich?
I would say the difference was not as distinct as you would think. There were certain things where the emphasis was a little different. The IIT had clearly a modernist direction in everything they did, and from a design point of view, but also the drafting and the exercises, like in the second and third year, all these brick walls that had to be drawn and how you do simple buildings. We didn't go quite through that in Munich. But Munich was a little more, maybe a bigger school, more academic. There were also many foreigners, particularly Persians, would you believe it, from Iran. I remember dozens of them. Well, this was when the Shah was still in control, and they were all studying there. And there were some wonderful architectural historians that are known in Germany, but I don't need to mention them here, that inspired me and how to look at things and which buildings were important. So it was a very good school, and in my opinion, it complemented fairly well what would have been expected at IIT. I also, even structural engineering, there was a statics course that I took where we had to do little simple calculations, which gave me an appreciation what's involved in determining the size of members or beams or whatever, you know. I don't know that you at IIT actually did that.
Well, and I think we've talked about this before, but one of the differences I remember you talking about was in Germany there was a kind of a lack of resources after the war, whereas in the U.S. there were a lot of resources. So the performance of a building, like the actual envelope, was kind of hit on. Talking about Passive House now was something you were learning in the 50s and 60s.
That is it's a good question, because we in the German school early on, and it came out of the war years where there was a dearth of oil and coal and those things, and heating was an issue. And then after the war, everything was destroyed anyway, and you couldn't heat your house, so you hung wool blankets over your windows, you know, to keep you warm. So the consciousness of energy and the impact it has on your life, the negative impact if you don't have the energy, was early was there early. And So that's why Germany today, they're pretty advanced in their thinking about these things. They're doing all kinds of programs. And in school, when we drew something, a house or the window detailing, boy, if that wasn't double glazed right then and there in school, you'd flunk the course. That was a no-no. And I come to Chicago and I'm working in the Mies office, and we're still doing buildings with single glazing, you know?
And it's
And-
0 degrees outside.
Yeah.
Yes. And I said to Mies one day, I said, why is that? Why are we still doing this way when this is really not the way to do it? And he said, well, remember, you're in America now. Energy is cheap. We just heat a little more.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if less is more anymore.
Yeah, that's true.
But then at the end of his life, in the late 60s, like 10 years later, so to say, we did the IBM building. And the IBM building was the very first building with thermally broken window glass and double glazing. In other words, all of it had caught up too.
Sure,
It was
sure.
just a matter of when.
Yeah. So we're about halfway through our time here, maybe a little more. So let's. I'd like to kind of fast forward a little bit and talk about kind of a little bit of my connection with you, Dirk. So I joined your office. You probably don't remember this, in 1979, actually. And at that time, the firm was called Fujikawa Contorado Lohan Associates. So I have a little bit of knowledge of those years. Of course, I was a junior architect at the time. Sometimes people still called the firm at that point the office of Mies van der Rohe. As a matter of fact, I distinctly remember some people laughing in the office once. They were holding up an envelope that had come, somebody applying for a job, and it was addressed to the office of Miss van der Rohe.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think the office became Fujikawa Contorado Lohan in 75, but then changed to FCL, and then finally in 86 became Lohan Associates. So can you tell us about some of these transitions, how the partnerships were formed, and how they changed until the firm just became, your name?
Well, in 1968 and 1969, after the 60s that I'd been in the office, Joe Fujikawa was one of the early students of Mies at IIT. Gene Summers was another one, and Bruno Contorato as well. They all had studied at IIT. Mies had picked them early, and they were, prior to that, there was Myron Goldsmith that worked in the office and several other people that ended up at SOM and whatever else. But Joe developed particularly an expertise in residential buildings with Herbert Greenwald and his successor firm, Metropolitan Structures. And he continued that all his life. And in a way, because that was formulaic type of work, Mies wasn't all that involved. But Gene Summers was sort of doing everything else. And then when Gene Summers left the office in the mid-60s, that was his desire to start his own practice. And as you all know, he ended up at Murphy doing McCormick Place and so on. But Bruno Contorato was a solid guy. He was really not one of the top designers or so, but he was technically and management savvy.
Bruno's the guy I started working for initially at the firm.
Yeah.
And I remember when I would sit and talk to him about something and I'd try to kind of leap ahead of something, he'd always bring me back. He was very, let's do this step by step. Let's talk about it step by step.
Yeah. Well, he, for instance, managed the whole IBM building project, coordinated the various architects that were involved with that. And Murphy was was one of the partners. And he was universally liked and appreciated because he was a good manager. And then towards the end of Mises' life, when he was 80, 81, I don't know exactly when, but he and I had a regular meetings and dinners, and so I was close to him by then, and I could speak to him like no one else could. Obviously, to your own grandfather, you can say things, right? And I said, Pa, you really got to do something about this office. When you're gone, there'll be pandemonium. There has to be a structure and that can survive and finish the jobs that are there. So as a result of that, he started thinking about it and talked to the lawyer, and they set up Joe Fujikawa, Bruno, and myself, because I had stepped into the Gene Summers role to some degree, and I was doing some other projects, not the residential apartment buildings and so on. And I was really the junior partner, but that's why the name was the way it was, which in hindsight,
A lot of syllables there.
yeah, for a while we called it FCL,
Right.
which was always very funny for a European. FCL means Football Club of Liverpool.
Well, didn't FCL come about when Joe Fujikawa departed because
Yes,
he didn't
yes.
he didn't want to keep his name on the firm?
Yes. Well, so what I knew would happen with time, but I was pleased that it didn't happen as a crisis, or there's gradually Bruno retired, then Joe Fujikawa did his own thing, and
So that was 1986.
so I was left
Right.
when you came.
Yeah, when I came. Okay, well let's move on here, Steve.
So, Dirk, I mean, obviously, we've gone through kind of your history of your offices and kind of some of the built work. Was there ever one project that you always wish you had gotten that someone had been given to someone else? Or
Oh, I'm sure, but now that's a difficult question.
well, that's why they invited me.
Yeah,
I can think of one if
yeah.
you'd like a
would you
hint.
help me?
So there was a competition in
The library,
hmm
the Chicago Library. Yes, that's a good one.
Can we talk about that?
Yes, we can talk about it. That was an interesting approach because they wanted a design-build approach for the first time, where you designed something and costed it, budgeted it or estimated it, and offered it to the city as a package, that this design for this cost. And the city had hired several prominent people like Vincent Scully from, is it Yale?
At the time, I think it was Yale, and then Philip Johnson was also part of the jury, correct?
No,
He wasn't?
I don't think so. Anyway, I know Cindy Pritzker was on the jury, and Liz Hollander was the planning commissioner at the time. And it was a big public process. You had to make a presentation at the cultural center in that auditorium there. And there were hundreds of people came and listened to all this. And our design was, it's interesting. There was one idea in it that I I learned in Munich from one of my professors. There is a museum in Munich for older art, but it has a very beautiful entry where you come in, and then there is a stair hall that goes from the lobby both ways up to the next main floor, and the whole thing is a gallery with light on the south side. In other words, very big space, and the stair is ceremonial. You can go this way or that way, and so I copied that idea into that design. So that was, and then the main library functions and the programmatic spaces were all on that main floor. And I remember that the librarians liked our design very much, but it was really, in the end, Tom Beebe's postmodern design that was chosen. I think largely because Vincent Scully and Cindy Pritzker were collaborating with each other. I remember seeing them once going from picture to picture in the exhibition, those two together. So,
Well, and for those that don't know, so that competition was well known. I mean, the participants, I believe, were obviously you, Helmut Jan,
yes,
had an Arthur Erickson from Canada,
yes, correct.
Hammond Beebe, and
Yes.
Babka at the time, I think it was.
Yes.
And then SOM and Ricardo Legarreta teamed up.
Yes,
And then there was a popular vote as part of that competition. The librarians kind of had a vote, and then there was the
jury.
And I think, as I recall, you're right. The librarians preferred your scheme,
Yes.
but then the jury and the popular vote went to Beebe's
yes,
scheme.
yes. I don't know if it was the popular, you mean the public?
I believe the public voted at the exhibition. I could be wrong.
Maybe the people that saw the exhibition could put a slip of paper in a ballot box. That's possible, yeah. I don't remember that so much, which is very similar to, and maybe it was even modeled after another experience I had in the 60s with the Lloyds Bank building in London that Mies was asked by Peter Palumbo to design, and Peter Carter from England was in the office. He worked on it. I worked on it. So I went over there several times. And ultimately, the city of London decided to have a public exhibition about it. And for the public to come and do exactly what you said, they could vote. But ultimately, it was Prince Charles, who didn't like modern architecture at the time, and he killed it. So it was not built, and Jim Sterling's building was instead built, not for Lloyds Bank, but for some other building on that square.
Well, talking about some of the projects from your past, you're still involved in the Berlin National Gallery
Yes.
and the renovation happening. What's it like to walk through some of your previous designs or be involved in seeing some of these renovations happening?
The National Gallery was, in a way, the dream project for me as a young architect. I was really pretty young. I was just 28 to young early 30s when I was sort of put in charge. I mean, first when it began, Gene Summers was still in the office, and I worked with him. But then when he left, I was the one. And I also spoke German, which was helpful. And I was sent over there to represent Mies quite regularly. And I remember that the building senator in Berlin, at one meeting, I was sitting there with these 65-year-old people, at 30 or whatever I was. And he said, Mr. Lohan, how old are you actually? And I said, I'm 32. And I was 28 or 29, And because I knew that you had to be over 30 to be taken seriously. I had sort of figured that out. And it did work fine.
I'm going to write that one down.
Well, you were already over 30.
Well, there was one particular story that stood out to me from that Berlin gallery where you and Mies tested the structure by driving under it.
Well, tested maybe more aesthetically than structurally. Yes, yeah. It's a very interesting and fascinating structure. That big square roof. I forget how much it weighed. It was enormously heavy, and it was all welded. It's an all welded structure, and it was raised hydraulically in one day, from the ground up to full building height. And this was the last time that Mies was in Berlin. And we had a car that I drove, and he was in it, and he said, "Well, why can't we go up there and I want to look under it when it was 8 feet up, you know?" And so there is a picture that's known that we're there, and then he's getting out of it, and with his crutches he walked under it, and I walked next to him to make sure he wasn't tripping on some rebar or something. And I looked always upstairs because it's an open, uh, what do you call
Space
it?
frame.
Space frame, but there are beams with flanges of 2 feet width. And if anything came down, you didn't want to be under a flange, you know? So I made sure I stood under the voids, you know. But Mies just didn't care.
Say,
He
Dirk,
walked in there, looked sort of, he had this funny way of looking with one eye. And the reason he was interested in it is whether what we had studied in the office for a long time and very seriously, whether there should be an uplift on the corners or in the center of the building so that the appearance of the final roof wasn't drooping.
you're talking about entasis.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Greeks.
Yes. It's that kind of refinement. It was a
Right.
visual refinement, and he was interested to see, as soon as the roof was up a little bit, whether that actually worked.
So what was the conclusion? So it was designed to have a little
Yes.
bent bow in
Yes.
it. I presume that Crown Hall had the same thing in its roof.
Well, maybe very little. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, most structural big beams, big spans have always a little
Camber.
camber, but that comes down through the dead weight
Sure.
to flat.
Sure.
But in this case, the idea was that there should be a visual camber that remains
Right.
to make you feel that it's
Right.
not drooping down on you or hanging down. Yeah.
Right.
And it worked fine.
Well, and I think one of the things about Mies that's misunderstood, everyone thinks of him as a modernist, but one of his first jobs, I think, was with Frederick Schinkel, and he learned a lot of those lessons from him.
Well, he
in
never
some
worked
classes.
with Frederick Schinkel
Oh, he
because
didn't?
he was dead already. But he picked up from Schinkel in the Berlin buildings that he visited and knew intimately some of the refinements and so on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Dirk, I have one final question here. One that we normally might have led with, but might make for a better closing question, and that is, can you describe your personal philosophy for designing, including how did it develop, and has it changed? More importantly, has it changed over the years?
Well, I have. I'm a modernist. I brought up that way. I believe in it. I believe that at the time of any architect's life, one should focus on future thinking rather than past thinking. That's my belief. That does not mean I don't like or I disregard the past. I mean, very important in my own thinking has always been to create buildings that have a relationship to their surroundings, the context, to whatever that might be, just that the scale or the volume of buildings should not be totally out of whack with the neighbor. There's so much of that going on, if you want to know my opinion. That's one aspect. The other thing that I feel very strongly about, I think a lot about the human occupant, the human user, or the visitor, and what they experience, what they think, and what it's like to be in such buildings. That grew out of my exposure to a lot of remarks about Mies's architecture that I've heard over the years. That his architecture is cold and is so rational and so intellectual and not human and humane enough. So I'm interested in human environments and a little warmth. There's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't mean you have to be postmodern, but bring a little color into things and make it pleasant and enjoyable and comfortable. Those are the things that I'm thinking about, and that's, for instance, on Ravinia is a good example. I think that dining pavilion has, because we chose the wood, has a real nice warmth to it, and it's welcoming, that kind of thing.
Good answer. Well, so I think that's all the time we have for today. Dirk, this has been a great conversation. I always find that I'm learning things, even though we've been working together for so long, that I've never heard before. I heard a few things today. I'd also like to thank my co-hosts, Stephen Dillon and Brittany Sublett, and great job on grilling poor Dirk today, guys.
Happy
So
to
that's
help.
it.
This was nice. I enjoyed it very much, and it's a very nice forum to do it that way.
Yes.
It's just a conversation.
All right. Thanks.
Thank you.